Okay, so we'll finish up here with our section on control. And so we'll talk a little bit about self-control, or what's also known as the general theory of crime. So a couple things to keep in mind, right, is that one of the authors of social bonds theory, Travis Hershey, was responsible for this, this like new iteration of a theory, right? And basically, he took issue with past theories because they were too convoluted, they were confusing, wasn't easily testable, and there's a lot of processes and stuff that makes it difficult to understand, right? And so, because he approaches things from a control perspective, is still interested in like what regulates people, like their self-regulation to prevent crime. So the big issue then is, so what could it be? What is it exactly, right? So, it's basically coming in is that he comes up with this idea then that the chief reason people will commit crime is a lack of internal controls. So you are not able to regulate yourself. So the key thing for him is self-control. So the issue with self-control then is that we think about this involves the ability to resist temptation and out of base desires. So let's say, for example, that you see something like in a store as a little kid, right? You may have like, oh, I want to take that candy bar. Or I remember a time when I was in daycare, there was like a prism, which I thought was like the coolest thing. It made rainbows on my hand, and I guess it's the kind of thing that's on the Dark Side of the Moon album cover. If you don't know what that is, Google it. So you resist the temptations out of your base desires, and so what ends up happening is that when you see something that you want, you kind of like hold back, right? So the goal then is to have like good internal regulation to prevent more crime, to prevent one's criminal tendencies. And that's pretty much it, right? There's no other process that's into place here. There's pretty much it. Like, that is simple, easiest kind of thing, right? Is that it's just simply your one's like lack of, impulse control, self-control leads to crime. And so the way that they end up painting this, right, is that if we think about what goes into like doing crime. Now, if you guys have ever done bad things, then you probably maybe familiar with some of this stuff, right? So the one is that, a lot of crimes, right, if you think about things like theft or larceny, which are like pretty good, or punching someone in the face, right, it's simple, and it's also something that you get immediate gratitude. So you can see instantly what you get for taking your action. You steal something, you punch someone in the face, right, it feels really good, right? So people with low self-control then aren't able to think long-term or about the consequences of their actions or what the benefits might be. So it's something that's simple, you have immediate gratification, you're more likely to do it. So they're very much in like thrill seeking, so things that are exciting or risky, right? Because that feels a lot better than always taking it safe in some other ways, right? So the more that you are excited about something, the more that you are willing to take risky stuff because you can't control yourself, the more likely that a crime is more likely to occur, right? So then we know that people then are impulsive. And so, like the act, they don't really think about it. It's a quick thinking process without slowing down, stopping, and to think through. So we, like with this then, people are short-sighted. And it's they're not really, they don't really consider others. So they're a bit insensitive to other people. So this is kind of interesting, right? Is that we all know that we have impulses. We all probably know someone who is impulsive, although sometimes people craft themselves as, I don't have low self-control, I'm impulsive, or I'm not impulsive or I have low self-control, I'm spontaneous, right? Question of the day for all of you. Then, do you think there's a difference between spontaneity, impulsiveness, and low self-control? That's a big question, right? I have an ongoing debate with a friend about this, and they say they're all the same, but you have like low self-control. Interesting enough, everyone who says that they're impulsive or spontaneous could also point to the fact they have like low self-control, and those are the ones that argue hardest that they're all the same thing, or excuse me, that they're all different. People are like, yeah, they're the same thing. Usually don't have issues with that. I'm curious to see what happens with y'all. So it's a relatively easy theory to understand, and Gottfredson and Hershey claim that you're pretty much set at age 8. That's when you stop developing your ability to regulate self-control. And that the key factor then is that good parenting, so if you're teaching your kid to mind or resist temptation or things like that, is going to equal less crime because you have more impulse control. But they basically take the notion that at age 8, it's stable. You can't really do this again. There's no way to alter it, which I think is a debatable point, right? So what do we do with this information then, right? First we find that if we think about this from a testing standpoint, so if we think about testing, key thing we need to find, right, is, how do we measure self-control? And how does it manifest itself? Does that mean some people are achieving things? Does this mean people don't do risky kind of stuff? Does this mean these people have lower speeding tickets? Does this mean that they, wait to eat like day-old donuts or something? Who knows, right? So there's this question of measurement, right? And we also, look at one's criminality or deviance. So, do you like street tag? Do you get into fights? Do you do, everything else that goes into place? Now, this argument then is that if we think about impulsive or, sort of exciting thrill-seeking, we can see that there's an explanation for men, in that men tend to be more impulsive, thrill-seeking than women, or I guess biological men tend to be more impulsive, thrill-seeking than biological women. So they're more impulsive in that aspect then, right? Also, we have a good explanation for age, right? So maybe, kids are more likely, or younger people, more likely to commit crime because they're focused on that. If we think about poverty, that one's more of a question mark, about what exactly would a poverty-stricken place mean to more crime. Some people might argue that because, in poverty-stricken areas, the family, is often unstable. There tends to be more areas with single-parent households in place. And because they're out working all the time, they're at home. They're not at home as much, and so they can't really parent as much. So that could be one explanation as to why, there's more crime in those areas, right? But tends, debatable, right? And then it gets a little bit tricky when we think about ethnic background in terms of, what exactly is it about someone's culture that, may contribute to that. Low self-control, general theory of crime, does really kind of poor understanding this kind of process, right? But we can see that, there is some stuff that's useful at this, right? So you could be open for discussion, right? Another part to consider is that if we can think about the scope of crimes this can explain. Now, it's really good for impulsive, short-sighted stuff. So, this is really good for, many crimes, right? So the petty theft, typical UCR crimes, you could say someone's getting killed, display a murder then. But how does this do when we think about white-collar crimes? So if we think about white-collar crimes, usually you're older, right? So maybe you're less impulsive, and if you're working on, embezzling or you're moving counts around, right? I mean, it does take a level of control and expertise that other people don't have. So what exactly happens here, right? So, how do we interpret this? How do we, control and regulate, what's going on with something, right? So that's something to keep in mind then is that how does this explain other crime types? Does this explain prostitution? Perhaps if people are addicted to drugs, then they do prostitution in order to get money for drugs, perhaps. Does this explain why someone becomes a drug dealer? I don't know, right? I mean, you could make the argument that it's maybe not so good for that, right? So I think that's other parts that you can kind of shift the discussion debate about is what exactly does or does not work for these kinds of behaviors, right? So the other part to consider then is we start thinking about scope of behaviors and what ultimately gets down. What do we do from a policy standpoint? So if we assume then that you're kind of fixed at age 8, at least according to the theory, your self-control doesn't improve, what do we do with that? So some people are just born and they're stuck at age 8, we never go back. Do we give up on them and don't do anything at all? I mean, like, what exactly, are we looking for here? So this will often, advocate for, like, in schools, they will, or, they'll advocate for, like, Head Start or sort of pre-K program where they emphasize, controlling or restricting your behavior. So, to control impulses, basically is what we're talking about here. At the same time, we're also concerned, outside of school behavior, right, about parenting. And this will lead to a lot of people that'll advocate for, nurses at home, parent teaching classes, some people also believe that in the strength of the family, they'll advocate that, we need to have parents at home and they're watching. You have two sets of eyes, like watching over people and so on, right? Yeah, some people believe that's better. Not necessarily the case, but like some people would advocate that. So we have a strong family institution in place, right? If it's also related with parenting, if we believe that parents are key, that, that maybe that means, better wages for a community, right? So for people, so if we pay people more, it's a more equitable society. People are less likely to work multiple jobs, and then they can do it. So you could say that education is key for the parent, or we need to have more equitable pay in order to make sure that kids down the road don't further commit crime, right? That'd be like one aspect to think of it, right? But there's a lot of ways to do it. But at this point, then, I'd be curious to hear about what policies do you see coming from this then, or how do we regulate people to regulate one's self-control? Fun fact, this theory has been tested quite a lot, right? And it's believed to be pretty consistent predictor of criminality by itself, in that low self-control leads to it. Now, is there evidence that at age 8 you're screwed? Maybe not so much, right? But, in terms of like being able to self-regulate and control your impulses, there's quite a bit of evidence for it, and it can apply to a lot of different crimes.